Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. My name is Aileen Novick. I'm the manager of School Group and Public Programs. We're so glad to see all of you. Yesterday evening, we started getting a lot of emails of people concerned about the storm, so I'm glad that we have a nice full room to join with us today for our talk with Pierre Terjanian, Bringing Arms and Armor to Life. Before we get started, I just ask that you silence any electronic devices or cell phones that you may have brought with you. That would be great. And to tell you that today's talk is being recorded. James White of Pixel Nectar is in the back. So if you do ask any questions at the end, just know that you will be part of the documentation of today's talk. Tomorrow is Martin Luther King Jr. Day. The museum is open for free to all. At 2 p.m. we will have a concert by the Joy of Music program students at 2 p.m. in the Renaissance Court if you would like to join us for that. Our next Arms and Armor demonstration is next Saturday, the 24th. We have returned to those being back up in the conference room. So at 11:30 and 2 p.m., Bayat Al-Assad will be here. They talk about Indo-Persian arms and armor. So that will be our next demonstration. And then our next talk is actually a talk with a film screening on Sunday, February 8th. Kaz Supernova will be here. He has the film Wartown Rising about the rise of hip hop in Worcester. So he's going to talk about that, and he'll also have some of the artwork that goes with the albums and CDs in the La-Di-Da Lounge just outside the conference room. So please join us for that. And now I'd like to introduce Matthias Voschek, the Jean and Miles McDonough Director of Art at the Worcester Art Museum, who's going to introduce our speaker for you. So welcome, Matthias.
Hello, everyone, and welcome, and phenomenal that you braved the storm warnings, and some of you came from Boston, so welcome. Along with our Higgins curator of Arms and Armor, Jeffrey Forgang, I'd like to join Aileen to welcome you. Yes, this talk was probably 14 years in the making when we were because Pierre joined the Higgins Museum discussion about constituting a core collection and making sure that this collection could be taken by another museum, because unfortunately the Higgins, in spite of its highly poetic headquarters on Barber Street or Avenue, was not feasible anymore, and they needed to join forces. The organization that was the most, how to say, probably the most supportive or likely, thank you, likely, I was looking for the word likely, to take over the Higgins collection was the Worcester Art Museum. And so Pierre helped constitute this core collection and accompanied at every step the development. I still remember, so Pierre at that time was the curator of Arms and Armor at the Philadelphia Art Museum. And then in 2012, I think, you moved to the Met. And we were in desperate need of donors, and normally people are very jealous about the donors of their museum, but Pierre was not of that jealous lot and connected me with several donors, but they were so faithful to the Met that we didn't get a dime. But still, I mean, the good intention counts. The good intention counts. And basically, this is part of our big capital campaign, the opening of the Arms and Armor galleries. I never thought that it would take 10 years from the closing of the Higgins Armory to opening the galleries here. You have no idea what you need to do to start all of this. From climate control to having sprinklers installed, to relocating a library, to doing all kinds of contortions. But we did it. And again, thank you, Pierre, so much for helping us in this endeavor. Pierre's trajectory as an art historian is very different from that of most, if I can say so, because you have various degrees in law, And there were some highly distinguished art historians, by the way, in the history of art history, like Erwin Panofsky, I think he was a lawyer as well. So those are the people with a very sharp analytical eye. People like me, we don't analyze, we just look. And sometimes we are right and sometimes we are wrong. You're always right. And he then got a PhD at Metz University, so in Lorraine, in France, in history. And in 1997, if I memorize this correctly, he came to Philadelphia, and the rest is history. He was appointed the Anne and Graham Gund director of the MFA in Boston last year, and we were all really excited about this because we are going to have, and already have, a real partner at the MFA to conquer the world together. So thank you very much. I look forward to all of that, and take it from here, Pierre.
So thank you very much, Matthias. I want to thank you all for being here today, braving the elements. Not something we're really afraid of, and I think in Massachusetts we've seen some snow before. I also want to thank the Worcester Art Museum and the staff for making it possible for me to come and speak to you about a subject that is very close to my heart. I may be now the director of a large museum, but I don't get to do this very often anymore, but I did spend 25 years being a specialist in this material. And went far and deep to try to understand it. And the idea for this presentation is very much, of course, driven by the installation of the Higgins collection at the Worcester Art Museum and the great celebration that followed. I've refrained thinking about how to speak to bringing armor to life, to think about the means, the ways you do it, and instead more about focusing on the what. So what is it that about arms and armor that could be of interest? And what do I, in my experience, has been a way you create engagement with the collection. Then you can think beyond that of how whether you do this with docents, whether you do this with technology, whether you do this with performances, whether you do this with lectures. There's so many ways you can create engagement, but my focus here is very much on the narratives and the kinds of stories that Arms and Armor can anchor, and particularly so in an art museum. This is a display of the Armeria Reale in Turin, which is a palace that became a home to a collection of arms and armor by the King of Sardinia. It became then King of Italy in the mid-19th century, and there is a long tradition of presenting armor as art in the context of palatial interiors, here with marble and gilding or moulu and even painted ceilings. And there are quite a few museums in Europe where you will have this kind of setting, Dresden and Vienna and so on. That's one setting, it's a common one. And then you have another that I'm showing here, which is the arsenal. That is the warehouse where you store mostly weapons of war. And this one is an antique one. It's in Graz. It's called the Landeszeughaus. And it's a building that has something like 30,000 spears, swords, guns, accessories, and corselets and helmets, mostly from the 17th century, because it was at the border of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, flanking essentially territories occupied by the Ottoman Turks. Here, things are presented on shelves and racks. It's not presented as art, and yet in that collection you have some objects that are highly decorated. Some of them that are unique, that involved a lot of care in the design, in the execution of the work, but the context is one of a military warehouse. And then you have the American Art Museum. This is a view of the Metropolitan Museum's galleries, where you have casework and you have objects are highlighted, and you have something that looks a bit like a baronial hall with standards hung above the rest. And here at the Worcester Art Museum, you have yet galleries that have been reopened with a slightly different concept, and we'll get to that. We know that this material has always been of interest to families and children. There is a je ne sais quoi about what it looks like, what it feels like. It helps, of course, that a lot of this material is stuck in time. A lot of it goes back to antiquity, and some of it is from the Middle Ages, the Renaissance. And of course, in major art museums, you have collection of arms and armor that are global. So you have Islamic cultures represented, you have Southeast Asian, and in the instance of this presentation, I'm focusing on European, not to exclude anything, but because I wanted to drive certain points home. Some of them are transferable, others are not. But I've been, for my entire career, thinking about how you engage audiences. And in my view, one of the key things is, even though this material can be presented suitably and effectively in an art museum, reducing arms and armor to art is a mistake. There's so much more that it has to offer, and everybody bring their own subjective interests to the table, and when they find an angle, some perspective that intrigues them, the rest will come to them. It's not possible for me to talk about arms and armor without talking about the business of effectiveness. At its core, armor was designed to provide protection, physical protection against threats, physical threats. And here I'm using an image from a famous Bible, which is in the Morgan Library. It's a passage in which King Saul is trying to convince David before he fights Goliath to wear armor. He declined to do so, but this is the scene where there's an attempt. And this is just to make the point that this child looked too vulnerable to confront what was a giant. And the physical threat to our bodies is ever present in all kinds of contexts, but certainly so in context of a duel, in the context of aggression and conflict. So in the Middle Ages, a number of solutions were developed to protect the body, and that includes mail shirts, all kinds of mail garments. It's made of links of metal. They're interlocked, and it provides flexibility. You see here on the left, somebody trying to put this shirt on and just in time before the threat materializes. And while it's very flexible and even comfortable, it can be tailored to your body. The image to the right shows that it's not a perfect defense against all kinds of weapons. Mail will reduce the risk of death. It will reduce the risk of injury, but it doesn't completely eliminate it. And the history of arms and armor, not a big surprise, is effectively can be told in the history of an arms race. The perfecting the weapons that will harm, and perfecting the defenses that will sustain the threat and actually protect. And that means that arms and armor are always evolved. It has evolved for a technological reason because of the continued changes, not just in weaponry, but in tactics. It's embedded in a much larger context. One of the threats that materialized early on, as already in the 13th century, is the use of the crossbow. The crossbow can fire bolts that have a penetrating force that's much higher than arrows shot with a longbow, and that would effectively make mail very ineffective against most missile weapons of the time, and therefore armor evolved from the flexible garments made of links to making solid materials on top of it. At first, boiled leather, scales made of horn, but ultimately plates of steel that would be forged to fit the body. The crossbow was used for hunting, in this case, birds. It could be used also for entertainment, target shootings. It was embedded in the civic culture of many places, but it was also a weapon of war. And it was devastating. It was so devastating that the papacy initially banned the weapon and proclaimed that anybody using a crossbow would go to hell. If you create these kinds of rigid armor that will protect against the bolts of crossbows, you run the risk of creating an immobile figure that essentially becomes a target. And at all times, the challenge of the armor is not just one of making defenses that are safe against the threats, but also something that allows the wearer to continue to operate. So you need to be comfortable in it. You need to be mobile. You need to be able to do what you need to do. If your armor is too heavy, you will be captured if you're fleeing a lost battle, or you will not be able to chase the enemy. Therefore, at all times, there was this question of how ergonomic, how comfortable, how well designed the articulation of these rigid parts is. And that's also a constantly moving proposition, this challenge to create something that is safe and yet operational. You can tell this story in many ways. Of late, you have videos like this one, which was in an exhibition in Vienna, where you have a perfectly reconstituted modern armor, but is a copy of an original one down to the weight of every element. And I didn't show you here a video, but basically the person wearing this is doing somersaults, is doing jumping jacks, and demonstrating that not only you can wear an armor, you can do a lot of things in them, even though this weighs at least 60 pounds or more. The notion that firearms brought about the end of wearing armor in battle is also a false one. And the use of handheld guns started very, very early on. Here's a 15th century representation of a horseman equipped with a very primitive type of gun. And it was always part of the equation. But of course, as guns became more effective, they could fire more frequently, they could have a longer range, have a greater strength for the projectiles. They started displacing the bolts of crossbows as the most devastating weapon in the battlefield. And that means that armor had to not only be able to resist those missile weapons fired by longbows and by crossbows, but also now firearms. The challenge there is if they were made very hard, which was great against other weapons, they would shatter like glass upon the impact of a bullet. So then they had to be made tough, but soft enough to absorb the impact and distribute the impact over the whole thing. So the armors were challenged with the notion that against certain weapons there was a sweet spot, and against others there would be qualities that would be best. So how could they anticipate what would be deployed in the battlefield? There's an underlying here history of technology and metallurgy. They had to change the way that they treated the iron in the furnace, and as they hammered it, how they reheated it, how they quenched it, what kind of ore they used in their work to write metallurgical qualities for their armors. They did that without having the science, modern science. They did that in an empirical way, looking at the color of the metal and the fire, knowing that a certain type of iron ore for certain places was more effective than other places. So there's a whole other story of the metallurgy of armor. In the 17th century, this is a detail from a battle scene, firearms were so ubiquitous that everybody was armored. And down to World War I, there were still cavalry units and the European armies that wore armor that was effectively bulletproof. It worked. They just at the time were wearing helmets and torso and back defenses. We have armors that have survived that show that they were tested by the buyers before they wore it. So they would be shot at, and if they were not pierced, then it was deemed of good merchant quality, and therefore they'd be acquired. You see the impact here of the bullet that was fired to demonstrate that the work was of sound quality. But as firearms became more and more effective, it became more and more common to add additional layers of defense, sort of layers, so multiple sheets of metal. And here I'm showing a detail of a reinforcing breastplate that goes on top of the torso of this man. Sometimes we reinforcing pieces for the skull, from the back for the vital organs. And that's at the time when the armor became extremely heavy and cumbersome. And that's when you start hearing a lot of criticisms about, is it worth being safe if you can't do anything in it? So it's a slow process that starts in the 17th century of limiting the use of armor to shock troops that are typically on horseback rather than infantry. But it's a very, very gradual process. And like many things of importance, there was a widespread disagreement as to who was right. And it took a long time to come to any conclusions. So fortunately, here at the Worcester Art Museum, you do have one armor of this type. It's exhibited in the paintings galleries, but it has this reinforced that is currently attached to it that would fit over the breastplate, has virtually the same shape and same decoration, so that it blends in. There's been a long tradition of studying firearms, ballistics, both in the context of antique weapons and modern warfare. Their properties, there's not been the same continuum of interest in the metallurgy of armor, but this is something that is now done by more than one scholar. There are lots of publications on the subject, which analyze fragments, elements of these armors and tell you a completely different story about this region figured it out. This region figured it out later. This region issued bans on exporting the raw material so that the others couldn't have it and couldn't do the work. The craftsmen who knew the techniques would migrate to a different country because they knew how to transform a metal and give it the right quality. So there's a whole history of technology, a history of migration, there's a history of competition that can be told with the subject of arms and armor. But when we think about armor, we often default to war, but armor is used in combat, and there are all kinds of combats more or less friendly. There was a tradition of judicial duels in Europe, where God would decide who was right. And those duels would have been fought to death, and therefore you hazarded your life in a lawsuit. If it was concluded by a duel, there would be then more friendly combats, which were more reenactment of warfare initially, and then more and more ritualized things like the joust. And this is an example here where the aim is with the lance to unhorse your opponent or to break the lance on specific parts of their body. It's a very violent sport. There are a lot of written accounts of the injuries and even death that occurred. While it was a sport, you did that to entertain people, typical for a noble wedding to have the jousts as part of the celebration, followed by dancing. People got killed and severely injured, and some sovereigns lost their lives. Henry II of France died with a splinter that entered his helmet in a peaceful contest against the commander of the Scottish Guard in Paris. So these things happen. After that, French kings refrained from jousting. But even the armor protected you from the horsefall, and there were no small feat that it absorbed the shock of landing pretty firmly on the ground after having been hit by somebody else's lance. In the Renaissance, everything became a subject of a scientific debate, and so some treatises were being compiled as to what pieces of armor are best for what kind of tournament. They would say, here are the ones you must have for this kind of tournament. That other tournament, needless to say, for somebody to own all this equipment was a huge expense. So this was reserved. These are not books, these are illuminated, they're painted albums for royalty and the higher nobility. And they would be coveted because it gave you an edge over your competitors about what is appropriate. And this is the front and back view of an exploded view, so to speak, of what would be worn in the Joust of Peace, which is a very specific contest fought in Germany, very popular in the late 15th century and early 16th century. And you have here in the collection one of the very, very rare surviving armors for the Joust of Peace that can anchor this whole story about effectiveness and the risks of friendly combat and the joust in general. Not only you have that, but you have the ability to tell the evolution of the genre with later examples where here a shield that is the target for the contest is bolted to the armor itself. And you have multiple versions, different dates, different style, different types of decoration, all in the Worcester Art Museum's collection. So you can go pretty far in discussing not just armor for war, but armor for friendly combat. Because armor was expensive, because the people who made it were secretive about how they worked, it's always been a competition to have a good armor. It didn't matter what your wealth was. The King of England didn't have access to good armors because there was no good iron in England. And therefore, all the armors of Henry VIII were either Flemings, Germans, or Italians, who supposedly would know what to do with English iron ore. And technically speaking, they had to import iron from Antwerp, which came from Spain or came from Tyrol, and it was a very complex business. But the possession of an armor to begin with is a status symbol. And at the lowest end of the spectrum, you have the male inhabitants of cities who have to serve in the urban militia, and they're expected to wear armor to defend their city from aggression. And you have the troops, the foot soldiers in the Renaissance armies. All they got is a helmet, and here a frontal defense, just the front. The back is not covered, the arms are not covered. Maximilian I of Austria commissioned thousands of these in Augsburg and Nuremberg and Ulm and a few other places. This is one example in collection in Philadelphia. It was designed so you would not flee, you would not turn your back to the enemy, because all they had. But you can see how modest this piece is. There's a central plate for the chest, and then 3 plates for the abdomen. It's articulated, but there's no frills here, no decoration. Yet it was tailored to the general shape of the outfits of the time. But at the Worcester Art Museum, you have the higher end of the spectrum. You can speak to what the nobility was able to afford. And here's a remarkable armor made in Augsburg and the middle of the 16th century. We know for whom. And you can see that it's embossed, that is, the metal was raised under the hammer, and it was etched using acids to create an indentation and graphic design. And it was gilt and it was blackened. And this has lost its original textiles, probably have been silk and lined with gold thread. So these armors are splendid. They're luxury items. A person of wealth would unfortunately have to acquire many because they would be out of style within about a decade. And so the wealthy elites, mostly the nobility, who didn't enter the clergy, would not have one armor, but they have a gallery of armors from different moments in life, and they had some for the tournament and some for war. And here you can anchor the story with the armors, but you can also do it with great portraits. So in your collection, you have here an English gentleman clearly standing proud of his station in life, being a gentleman pensioner to Elizabeth I. And he's wearing an armor that looks Italian, but could be from Flanders or even France, working in the Italian style. Clearly very important attribute that is showing here. And you have, at the time where armor is no longer used in the battlefield, 18th century portraits that, again, show noblemen wearing armor because it's such an important part of their identity. They are the warrior class, the ones who are expected to take command, the manifestation of the authority they acquired by birth, by virtue of being a noble, is expressed by the armor that they wear, not only on portraits, but oftentimes on their funerary monuments. It's how they present themselves to the world. In the middle of the 16th century, it became more and more fashionable to just wear one piece of the armor, the neck piece, and you would do that not just in portraits, but even in real life, as a fashion accessory. And you see in here the Duke of Savoy, Emmanuel Philibert, wearing just the neck piece of an armor that survives, that is now on display in Vienna. And you have here in the Worcester Art Museum a late example of the genre that would have been worn with civilian dress. It's just this one thing that you wear around the neck that reminds everybody who you are, where you come from, how you stand in the world that you inhabit. Obviously, it's ostentatious, silvered, gilt, because it's making the point that you're part of a very select group. Armor is so important as a status symbol that children, at least the ones who are expected to follow their fathers in the rule of lands, often wore armor, in part for training, but in part for inscribing themselves into this line of rulers. And here is an image of the Duke of Brabant, who's introducing his two eldest sons to his vassals. And they're wearing armor. You can imagine you have to get a new one made every 2 years or so for each child. Huge expense. But it was so important that it found its place also in portraiture. And here is, for example, a young man or a teenager putting his hand on a helmet is too big for him. That's the helmet he will wear someday. It may be that of his father, which is decorated with oak leaves and almost certainly a reference to the family to which he belongs. But there's a reflection of his face on the helmet. So the helmet is functioning as a mirror and is foretelling the greatness of his future existence as the successor of his father. And then that tradition continues. Sometimes you even see a pistol in the hands of these children. This is Maurice of Orange-Nassau, here presented as, again, somebody who is going to be in charge with just the helmet and the gauntlets on the side. He's wearing the neck piece and the torso armor. And you do have here in the collection one of the most exquisite cuirasses. That's the torso defense made for a child, which is in the first gallery. When you see it, I had frankly forgotten about it, but after all, there are a few thousand objects in this collection. And it is very finely made, even though it's plain, undoubtedly made for a young boy, a very high standing. You have other examples of how the status thing is so prevalent, which is armors are decorated with the individual emblems of their owners, so that they're sporting the identity, not just the status, but the identity further. This is not here. This is in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. This is a man who was appointed commander and governor of a city that belonged to Venice, to the Republic of Venice, and they were called the Podesta, and they had to rotate every 3 years, so they didn't stay there for very long. Had an armor made with the symbol of the city at the top, and below his coat of arms of his family that shows a bridge over a river. His family was called Da Ponte, and this is an armor he could only use for 3 years. But he made the point that he was in charge of that city, and for solemn occasion, that oftentimes that triggered the commission of an important armor. Well, here you have this armor for the field and tilt of a gentleman who is represented himself. He's not really a portrait of him, it's a representation of him in prayer, showing he's a devout person, signifying something about his values. He's a good Christian. He believes, he fears God, And it's also a little talismanic on something you wear in combat to have invoke a divine protection, which could be, if not the body, at least that of the soul. Every piece of this armor is decorated, and elements of it actually have the coats of arms and the accompaniments of the owner. So in this picture, there's a close-up in the center. You have the shield with this a coat of arms, and then the shield will be surmounted by stylized helmets with crest, a bearded man with a hat, and here wings. And it matches exactly the arms of this family. So if you saw him, didn't have to speak to him. If you were a part of the elite, you would recognize the coat of arms, which is on the breastplate, which is on the neck piece, prominently featuring who he was. Now, this way of signaling who you are can be deceptive. So this gentleman here is the younger brother of Philip IV, the famous patron of Velasquez. And he's here in the guise of the Commander General, Governor General of the Low Countries, where the territories are occupied by the Habsburgs, the Spanish branch of the Habsburgs. He went to Brussels to lead an army. He defeated people along the way, some Swedes, and then he eventually settled and governed the Low Countries on behalf of his royal brother who stayed in Spain. And it was therefore suitable to show him in armor as a commander. The sash, the red sash across his chest is signaling there's a part of the Spanish branch of the Habsburgs. But this is him again. This is who he really was. He was a cardinal. And he was one of the youngest children of the family, one of the youngest boys, and it was never intended for him, it was never part of the plans for him to become a secular ruler. Unfortunately, his older brother died, and therefore, since there was a shortage of other men in the family, he was promoted to being a secular ruler or governor, military governor overnight. And the advisors from Flanders Road said, please don't have him come in his cardinal garb. This is not reassuring. We're at war with the Dutch. Have him come in armor, and this is a point that armor can project different kinds of images, and the same people can play different roles depending on what they wear. So armor was part of a way of projecting a certain message when it was needed at certain times, which is why you find it in portrait. There's no doubt that this armor existed, by the way. This is another example of deception. This is an armor that was commissioned in great haste in Italy for Henry VIII. By that time, Henry VIII was a pretty corpulent man. He needed this armor urgently because the English were going to besiege a French stronghold called in Boulogne, and the siege of Boulogne was not going well. And the king had to make a personal appearance to reinvigorate the efforts of the troops. And he needed a new armor that would fit his body. It was made in Italy because, again, even though he had armors in England, it needed to be a really good one. It was made in haste, but what this armor is not telling us is that the King of England had gout and basically was actually transported horizontally on a stretcher and was unable to walk or ride a horse and certainly couldn't wear the armor. So this armor here is a memento of this ambition, of this importance of the image, but it does not always capture something that actually happened. And here's a final example. We're now back to Philip IV at a young age. He started his rule in 1621. This is a bit later. He's showing the fabulous armor. This king never saw combat. He never went to a battle. But he needs to be showing as the leader of his country, and the militarized allegory of him wearing armor is one way of inspiring confidence in his abilities. Those who were close to him knew he had no experience of any of that. But it is part of how you construct an image by being seen in armor, by owning armor. He actually owned armors like these. And every ambassador, every important figure that came to Spain was taken to the army to see his, just in case. Beyond this status thing, armor can be an expression of one's taste and style. This is an extreme example. The core of this armor is in Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna. It was made in the 1480s. And the helmet is in a private collection, but it's the one that belonged to the armor. And in an exhibition I did in 2019, we're able to reunite the body and the limbs with the headpiece. You can see how extravagant this armor is, very narrow waist. Of course, it's made for an 18-year-old, it's a pretty young man still. But you will notice the feet, right? The extension. There's a reason for that. This is the outfit of men at the very same time in the same place, and what is the Low Countries. Maximilian I was he was Archduke of Austria, but he ruled as Count of Flanders, Duke of Brabant in the Low Countries, and he was wearing stylish armor that had all the features you would expect from the period. Very narrow waist, Very long legs with almost no distance between, almost nothing covering the abdomen. And it's true of the back too, where even the pleats of the garb will be repeated in the armor, and the very low collar is replicated by the armor. So armor at all times was informed by civilian dress. Civilian dress was exciting for men at the time, I'm pleased to report, and it changed. It changed, and the best armorers did not just make something that was practical, it made something that was beautiful and something that made you look great. It did something that actually would be inspiring. And there were fashionistas among the rulers, not all of them, who really wanted to, not only to have a great-looking armor, but they wanted the style that was from Milan. Think haute couture. Things that came from Milan, things that came from other places, they had to have one of those. It was very hard. Sometimes they had to negotiate with other rulers for that armor to be able to be exported and come to them, even at times of war. You have here in the Worcester Art Museum the example of what followed. We're only here about 30 years later, and you have an abrupt change in the proportion of the body, very rotund, much heavier built, which is following this male dress of the Renaissance. And you can trace this evolution, different changes in the way that the torso is constructed, with a series of armors, all in the Worcester Art Museum. And back to this one, which is a very late example from the early 17th century. When I speak to armor in fashion, armor was often worn with textiles. Those almost never survive. They sometimes covered the armor, they sometimes went under the armor, sometimes they just covered parts of it, but it was very important. So you see in paintings that oftentimes there are memorial that will show who it is who was wearing the armor. This is showing the coat of arms of the person wearing it. But we have fortunately a young Augsburg patrician, part of the elites, a merchant, who kept a book of all the fancy outfits that he commissioned, including the armors, at what age he wore them. And for literally 40 years, he had various artists track which outfit he wore on what day, for what occasion. And so you see here the plumage that goes on the hat, which is very important. You see the stripes and the kind of leggings that he's wearing. We know that for hunting boar, you wore armor, and you have specific hats and robes that go over the armor. None of this survives, but we have abundant iconography. We can recontextualize armor in the context of fashion and textiles. Those things are actually not mutually exclusive, even though there's such different materials. And here is the Duke of Bavaria, who had his court tailor record every outfit that he'd made for him and for his relatives before they would go on the trip. And they're very exciting because they show you the colors, the patterns, all worn in combination with the armor. Underneath those hats, there are helmets. And there are the details of all the inscription of what fabric they use for which part. These things are rare, but there's a lot of imagery that can bring armor to life, and particularly from this context. Another thing is, armor was often decorated with patterns, and this is a very rare example of a painting of a field marshal, high-ranking commander from the late 16th century. I pause here, it takes a little time. If you look at the elaborate pattern on the armor in the gilt area, it's actually replicated with embroidery on these breeches. So he went to a tailor and said, make something that goes with this armor. It was important it would be matchy-matchy. And that is part of the world in which armor gravitates. It's a world of tailors just as much as a world of metal workers, metalsmiths. Armor is also a manifestation of connections, and there are so many connections. One is gifts. This is an armor for the joust, worn by an Italian gentleman who was so famous for never losing to anyone. Maximilian invited him to his court in Innsbruck, challenged him. This man proceeded to defeat every champion that Maximilian put before him. And ultimately, before departing, he never jousted with Maximilian. He gave this armor saying, I was here. It has my arms on it. I was here, defeated all your champions. Nice meeting you. And so this armor was kept as a memento of somebody who was bigger than life. His name was Gaspare Sanseverino d'Aragona. This is another kind of armor that was commissioned as a gift from this is French, in the beginning of the 17th century. It was commissioned by this gentleman here, Jean-Louis de Nogaret de la Valette, who was ambassador of Henry IV, King of France, and negotiating financing of his war when France was experiencing a civil war between the Protestants and the Catholics. And the mission of this man was to raise monies in the German cities nearby that were sympathetic to the Protestants. And to say thank you, once Henry IV became King of France, unified France, put an end to the Civil War, he had this armor commission to be put in the arsenal of the city of Strasbourg as a way of memorializing this connection. So the armor is not always meant to be worn. It's sometimes more of almost like a monument that celebrates a very special relation. So many armors lend themselves to this type of exploration. Here's yet a different story. This is a very fancy armor in the Metropolitan Museum of Art made for Henry II of France, the one who was killed in a tournament. And it was gifted by his widow to a German prince who has lent assistance during the same conflict. Here he is, Johann Wilhelm I, Duke of Saxon-Weimar. He was rewarded with that armor for his services, having raised money and brought mercenary troops to France to fight against the Protestants. And that armor stayed in Weimar until War I, and then with the changes that happened during War I, eventually found its way to America. But the story is that of a widow who thought, my husband would have liked you to have this. And you would appreciate what it means to have one of his. And that's the only reason it survived, because everything in France was destroyed pretty much during the French Revolution. But this one being in Germany escaped the same fate. Also, tokens of friendship. So this is Henry, Prince of Wales, who didn't live old enough to become King of England. But he had a visit from a German cousin. He didn't have many German cousins, but he had one from Brunswick, came to the court. He said, now in England, we actually make good armor. I have one made to your measure. Took many years, 3 years for this armor to be made. It was sent and it was received, we have letters, by the Duke of Brunswick as a token of appreciation, a souvenir from his visit to the British Isles. And the armor was so important in the family that not only him, but his successors all wear this armor up to the 18th century. So the portrait of the man here is not somebody for whom the armor was made. And by the way, this is for a 13-year-old, a teenager. This is a grown-up man. The armor would not fit. So the portraiture is just recapturing a special connection to the King of England or to the Crown of England. And it would be celebrated. It had a niche made for it in the castle, and it was put in pretty much every portrait for a very long time. So these things resonated beyond their working lives. Armor was often collected as trophies. Here's a famous duel that happened between Maximilian I and one of his courtiers in 1498. Think of a political summit. They fought long and hard. Maximilian was much younger. Claude de Vaudreuil was considered a martial art expert. Think of a sort of pro wrestler combined with somebody who's also a jouster. And strangely enough, Maximilian defeated him. We don't know if this was fixed, but he did. And by virtue of being the winner, he confiscated the armor of the loser and kept it as a symbol that he, a young ruler of the Holy Roman Empire, was effectively capable of defeating one of the strongest men in his realms. And so this armor survives to this day in Vienna. It was long kept as a memento of Maximilian's greatness. Shields captured in combat from the enemy would not only be kept, but then captions were added at the bottom to record the circumstances of their capture. So trophies of war is a common thing at the time. A particularly grim one is in Toledo. If you're ever in Toledo in Spain, in the cathedral, there's a chapel that was built by the new reigning family that was essentially serving as a funerary chapel. And they put in there an armor captured in battle about 50 years earlier from a man who was a Portuguese who was holding the standard of the King of Portugal. They had to capture the flag, and the man lost both arms in combat, and then they took the armor and they displayed it in the church to remember the greatness of the Castilians and the failure of the Portuguese. So a lot of armor spend time in churches, and effectively churches function as time capsules, allowing for those things to stay untouched for a very long time. And that brings me to another point. They often serve in a funerary context. So this begins in Roman times. This begins in very ancient times. What people are buried with the armor. Armor is shown in the funerary monuments that celebrate their lives. This accounts for the existence of very early medieval shields that were kept in churches. This is a Swiss one. There's some in Marburg in Germany that survived because of that. The shield was a very important part of the identity of knights. You have here a lady giving a knight his helm, or his great helmet, along with the shield that is suspending here from a tree. And the crest that sits on the helm, the helmet itself, and the shield are the most important thing that tells somebody that this is a knight. It's so important that that's how the beginning of heraldry. So the idea that there's a design or logo that identifies a lineage, a family, is reproducing visually in an abstracted way, just the shield, the helmet, and then the crest. This is the arms of the Dukes of Milan and the Viscontis. And it was a fact that you suspended those trappings over the tomb of the deceased. This is the so-called Black Prince, Edward of Woodstock, a major actor of the 100 Years' War. And in Canterbury Cathedral, this helmet here with his crest, his shield, his gauntlets, and other elements were suspended above his tomb. There are now replicas in place. So the funerary achievement armor served beyond life as a marker of one's identity, and that accounts for the survival of this great helm, which is now in Vienna. Or here, a helmet is now in the Germanisches Nationalmuseum in Nuremberg that was incorporated in a very elaborate heraldic design celebrating a local noble, the Ritter von Kronborg family. But the helmet was at least 200 years old by the time they created this monument. So there's no real correlation between the individual and the helmet. It's just something that was kicking around and used to make the point. They were paraded in the funerary processions. Here is one where you will see the shield and the helmet being paraded. This is happening in Brussels, and we're commemorating at this time the death of somebody who died locally, so that it might have been his helmet, but sometimes it would be the King of Spain, and we have a helmet made and a shield made for the procession. And this would then be placed over the tomb. And of course, at the Worcester Art Museum, you have examples of these helmets for funerary use. Here's an English one that was modified to be hung in the English church above the tomb. So you can talk about this. Devotion is a big deal and during this period, and it was also a common thing that said, I need the Lord's assistance at this very moment of great danger. As a traveler or in combat, I will donate my armor to the Virgin, to God, if I make it through. And honoring those vows, a number of rulers and noblemen gave their armors to churches as a memento of what happened. So in Paris, until the French Revolution, there was an equestrian statue of a king of France who had made such a wish. This is one of the last records of it. It's completely gone. In Chartres, in the cathedral, during the 100 Years' War, there's remnants of an armor that was given either, we're not sure by whom, because so many people gave armors to the Chartres Cathedral, that this could be by Philippe IV, Philippe le Bel, or it could be by the Dauphin, successor to the throne. But several armors were donated and have survived up to this time because they are more than that. They were a connection to God, and they were a manifestation of the God's assistance, of divine assistance, that would inspire others to be devout and to worship. And so they had a dimension way beyond the material things. And it's thanks to that, here is a sanctuary near Mantova, which still in the beginning of the 20th century was filled with armor of various people who had donated armors. And it was placed in niches like you see them here, overpainted with mannequins. They were put in the boiling water to remove all the paint, and they were cleaned up and cataloged by a curator of arms and armor from the UK, now world famous. And here's the armor front and back, and the mannequin onto which it was mounted at the time. So armor really found its place in unlikely settings. They were also used to inspire others and talk about heroic role models. And so this is an Archduke of Austria who was based in Tyrol, but first in Prague, who built a collection of heroic figures. He ultimately moved to Ambras Castle, which is near Innsbruck, and here's a view of it today, where he created a gallery of heroes. Not only he put all these armors that he collected from various figures that he respected, but he also created what is considered the first museum catalog in the history of the West. So he had a catalog written in Latin first, because that was the universal language of Europe. And then he had a German version, a vernacular version for the locals to understand. You could buy copies of it. It has a representation of the armor as displayed in a niche, and it has a biographical entry accompanying, so you could be understanding what these people had done during their lives. Interestingly enough, the figures embedded in this narrative were not just friends, they were also foes. They were Turks, they were awful Huguenots, But he felt that this was a story of leadership, and therefore this was also very much meant to be an inspiration about what it's like to be a leader. And some of these armors, here's a famous Wilhelm von Roggendorf wearing a very extravagant armor, have survived, and it's in Vienna thanks to this. Well, here you have also important pieces like that are sort of associated with heroic moments. These are a pair of gauntlets made for Philip II of Spain when he was still a young man. He wore the armor at the Battle of Saint-Quentin, where they confronted Frenchmen, which they defeated suitably. And he's actually shown here wearing the armor by Titian. And you have on the table the gauntlets. Now, he had multiple gauntlets with this pattern. We don't know whether the one in Worcester are the very one on this table, but they're part of the same armor. And it's to say, again, you have these connections between deeds, heroic deeds, and the object as mementos. It's hard to talk about armor without putting faces behind them. It's not just stuff. There are the people who made them were well-known, highly respected, some of them very successful business people. Armor starts with this. This is what iron ore looks like. So you have to imagine crushing this, turning this into a ball of iron, and then turning into this. The armors were more than blacksmiths. They're very accomplished in so many techniques. And we have all kinds of imagery from the period showing quaint workshops, not sure exactly what this would have looked like. But they were visited by important people. They would check on their measurements. And this is Maximilian visiting one of his armors. The people who made mail tended not to be as well known as the people working plate. This is not as sculptural, but some of them are remembered because of very specific circumstances. The more famous ones who work with sheets of metal, some of them were ennobled. So here's a grant of nobility, of title of nobility and coat of arms to one of them, Hans Zeusenhofer in Innsbruck. Some were so successful that built mansions. So this is the Missaglia in Milan. This building sadly was demolished in 1902, but it was considered something important at the time. And so some antiquarians took some drawings of the building, elevation drawings, and even details of the facade was painted. The facade was polychrome. It had landscapes painted on it. It has the logos of the armors. They put this logo on their armors. They had punches, but it also puts all of the coats of arms of their most famous clients, advertising. And this is a detail of this is the mention of an armor. So the idea you see in the popular culture, whether in a hut with a forge and an anvil, that's not the condition of most armors. Some of them were entrusted with diplomatic missions because they were the only ones who could get close to the body of a sovereign. It took them hours to measure how their feet were turned and so forth. They could have conversations during the meantime. Some of them became the chief magistrates of their city. Some of them became mayors. And there's a huge biographical information that's come out, and we have all these names, virtually unknown to the general public, of prestigious armors. Fortunately, we have many of their works because they signed them. You can tell from this helmet that they could act as sculpture. Here they're transforming the wearer into a Caesar. You have pieces like this made for Charles V, which probably had a face defense as well. That's now missing. But here you're no longer in the business of defense. You're in the business of image making. And proudly, some of them commissioned medals of themselves or their friends thought they were worthy of being commemorated. So we have their effigies are preserved. And we have anecdotes. So the one on the right, Anton Pfeffenhauser, was known to have very bad manners. Everybody saw him, say he's great with the hammer, but when you're seeing him, he's actually an impossible man. Nevertheless, he was also a troublemaker. He followed none of the guild rules, constantly escaped rules. We can bring the makers to life. Like, it doesn't have to be just names. We know a lot about painters. We know a bit more about sculptors. The armors have not been given their fair share. And we have works by them. This is by Coleman Hemschmidt, the first one. That is the first medal. We have work by Anton Pfeffenhauser here in Worcester. So we can anchor the stories with actual objects. The other thing is arms and armor is often siloed. So the notion that these armors worked in the military-industrial complex of the Renaissance is false. They're completely embedded in everything. Some of them married prominent court painters, well, not themselves, but their daughters, or their widows remarried. Their collaborators came from different fields. So Daniel Hopfer was a painter, engraver, woodcutter, etcher. This is one of these targes, a shield that you wear in the tournament. It's meant to be hit by the pointed metal piece that is at the end of the lance of your opponent. And yet it's highly decorated with etchings, little figures, and gilt. by Hans Hopfer. Proudly, he signed this work. But Hans Hopfer also made title pages for important publications at the time. He was interested in the alphabet and typeface. So he created designs of what would a modern typeface look like based on the rediscovery of Roman type. He created compositions of ornaments and beasts and things like that could be used by other craftsmen. He represented soldiers at the time. This was recently acquired by the Worcester Art Museum as a complement. But you have to think this is the same person who was then decorating armor. This was not beneath him. He signed the armor. Sometimes he didn't sign his print, so he just has his initials. So he took equal pride in being involved in both lines of business. And he was also capable of doing portrait. This is a portrait of Martin Luther that he did with great brio. And there are many other examples. One of them is Jean Cousin the Elder, a French painter and ornamentist. We have hundreds of drawings by him for pieces of armor made for royalty. There are just the small design that match exactly the surviving armors that were used as templates by the goldsmith, and then would like raise the metal and chisel it and punch it to create those patterns and then gild it. And you can see that he was an inspiration for many of the most elaborate armors made during the Renaissance. But he was a miniature painter. We have books by him. He was a full-scale painter. This is in Pushkin Museum. I've never seen this in person. But he painted the kinds of subjects that appealed during the Renaissance. And those are people who didn't think it was beneath them to be involved in the design of armor. So this larger cosmology of artists is something that's still to be explored. At all times, armor was a spectacle. I think that's my driving point. It was not just meant to function, it was meant to be seen. There's a lot that is lost. We do not have such figures and that you can put in a museum anymore, unless you really reconstruct it. The standard, all of this livery that is here on the shield, on the horse. You have paintings that remind us the kind of extravagant sleeves that will be worn with certain types of armor. But we have a lot of visual iconography, and the splendor of armor was at all times something that mattered even to the more humble wearers. The settings in which armor was seen is now unfamiliar. This is a celebration of a baptism that was a reason to invite many friends and have a tournament in this great hall in Lorraine, in Nancy. It was such an important thing that the sovereign wanted it to be remembered, and he commissioned his court artists to do all these engravings of what the room looked like. So all the participants were going to fight with spears and swords. And you can see here the assistants, like ready to watch, the security forces, so there's no trouble. And this is indoors. And you have here another view of the combat in process with even tribunes to watch down, artificial lighting. Very hard for us in the museum to recreate this. But this is the world we need to bring back to understand the pomp and the spectacle that came with armor. This is the procession that preceded one of these contests, where you have music, you have children that accompany the knights that are going to fight, and needless to say, extraordinary plumage that goes with these armors. So when you think about museums, and I'm wrapping up here, I'm pleased to say, you have to think about all these narratives. I didn't go into the techniques used to decorate armor or to shape it. There's so much more. In the 19th century, they had a romantic appeal. If there's any armor in existence at all, it's because they were rescued in the 19th century. On the Enlightenment, said this was things of obscure, dark age era, not really useful except maybe for scientific understanding of warfare. It should collect one sample and throw away all of the rest. A lot of armor was actively destroyed in the 18th century. On the other hand, is at the same time that Romanticism begins to take root, and that led some people to salvage armor for sentimental reasons, because of what it evoked, or because it would connect it to certain figures. And this is one of the great neo-Gothic armories of Germany in Erbach, Schloss Erbach, that shows you what very much the museum setting might have been like for the Higgins Armory here in Worcester, recreating this sort of this great space. That was one museological way of presenting arms and armor to the public. In places, sometimes it's an important part of local history. Here in Solothurn in Switzerland, and the armor is presented with mannequins, telling the history of an important summit that took place in 1481. Doesn't matter, the armors are about 200 years later. And it's telling you how the Swiss cantons decided to set aside their differences and unite to defend themselves against any aggression. This is very important in the national pride of the Swiss. And this is a display that was conceived in 1845, has remained untouched. So it comes with the somewhat corny figures that would have been made in the 19th century. It now has been graced with a 1970s sound system. So you can hear them debate the thing, but it's meant to create local engagement, and it's an important piece of museology because this is a diorama from the 19th century, from the mid-19th century, that has been left alone. It's an experience in itself. This is another way of presenting arms and armor. I don't know if Worcester, whether you would really want to talk about local history in using the Worcester Art Museum's collection for that purpose, but there it makes sense because they have it and it's always been there. So with the galleries that are open here, you have both, I think, the sort of the drama that one would expect in a romantic period, with the armor presenting here on its own, very much with figures alive, with also pretty dramatic lighting and a lot of context to the projections. And then you have the mass effect of the arsenal. A lot to see behind, and what I particularly enjoyed as my personal experience being here for one of the opening festivities is the fact that there is a section where you can touch the objects, you can try them on the replicas, but the point is you can get a feel for it. And myself, when I was with the Metropolitan Museum of Art, I organized hip-hop battles with dancers wearing armor, and then all wearing replica, but it was very heavy stuff. And the children afterwards could try things on and get a feel for the material. And this direct engagement, the ability to touch, is also one of them. So I really want to thank you for your patience. I only touch on a few directions. I think there's actually more to it. But as you can tell, I think there's a huge potential for activating the collection and bringing the armor to life beyond what you can see. There's so much that is invisible, in my view, valuable. Thank you.
Does anyone have a question for Pierre?
Hi, that was an amazing talk. Earlier you mentioned in the early development of play, oiled leather. Where we term queer reading.
Letters, you said, sorry?
Oiled leather.
Oiled leather, correct.
Could you talk a little bit about what we know about this oiled leather, or where?
Well, we don't know enough, but we know quite a bit already. The history of armor is a complex one. There is moments where the strong belief was that one layer of the right material is all you need. And in the middle of the 14th century, it's all about every conceivable layers of different material. Some of you dress in layers. Other among you might not. You want the one sweater is going to do the job, right? There were similar convictions with armor. So there were times where you wore a leather garment above a shirt, and that could be sometimes made of stitched layers of leather. Then you would have another rigid material, which could still be organic, and that could be horn. And then you have some metal reinforcement. But leather was one of the most versatile materials that there was. And so it was possible to take very thick leather and layering it, putting it in shape, boiling it, and then leaving it to dry in a mold, basically. And this hardened leather was enough to stop arrows. It was enough to stop arrows. It would certainly slow down most sword cuts. It was good because it was not breathable, but it would not get hot or cold like a metal would in different times of the year. It would not rust. And it was relatively inexpensive. And a lot of the visual material we have doesn't tell us what's leather or not, because there's a lot of interpretation. Fortunately, we have inventories, payment records, digressions by armchair commentators at the time saying, too much leather, not enough leather, this kind of leather is better than the other. But leather was a very long time used, and it had its merits. Certain cultures, I focused here on European because I wanted to keep the narrative somewhat simple. But for example, in India, making shields out of buffalo hide was a very long tradition. In some other places, rhino hide is a way you make shield. You cannot imagine a more stubborn material. So leather has its place. in Korea, for a very long time, people wore armor made of paper. Rough paper, assembled in layers, effectively stop arrows. There has been reenactors have tried it. It's very effective. So we have, I think, this idea that armor equals metal, and that's our bias, informed in part by popular culture, maybe by a certain European focus. But the truth is armor can work with whatever is available locally. And in oceanic places, they use fish skin and other found materials as well, including shells. When you think of the Odyssey, you will see all kinds of movies where people are wearing bronze armor. There's no bronze armor at the time. The helmets are made of boar tusks that are stitched onto a leather hat. So you have a leather hat that is lined with boar tusks. Nothing cuts through the boar tusks. It's one of the toughest material. Some of the jousting shield of the Renaissance were lined with horse teeth. That you find that, but then it's covered with a layer and it's painted and decorated. But you have it in the records. They buy some horse teeth to finish the shield. So it's a complex war. But yes, this is maybe a lengthy answer. But there's the history of materials in itself. Another way of thinking about arms and armor.
So obviously this is the best collection in Worcester. Is this the best collection in Massachusetts, the East Coast, the United States, et cetera, et cetera?
So it depends on your criteria. It's one of the largest collections in the United States. I think it's the second largest collection in the United States. It has absolute gems, but I don't think in an art museum quantity is the most important way of rating a collection. So I here struggled to only include those things. I had at some point a gladiator helmet in this presentation. I had to take it out. That's something you never see. You hardly ever see. So this collection is phenomenal in many ways. It has this geographic stretch because it has quite a few things from antiquity, and this gladiator helmet is one of very, very few known to exist. I can only think of two others. Then you have very specific armors that are very well preserved. There's one of the jousting black armors that I showed, I think even has interior lining, is now showed disassembled, so you can see what the leather lining on the inside would be. But then it also depends on whether you want to use an armor collection to tell stories about the elites or everyone. And some collections are stronger in having the span. Others are, if you go to Dresden, it's only the armor of their bodyguards and the rulers. The nice thing also about this collection is it's a collection is well documented. There's quite a bit of information how it was acquired, so you have the genealogy of where these pieces came from, where they were kicking around. A collection that just has objects and doesn't have the depth of information behind the objects is a real loss, and this collection does have that. So I think there's still opportunities for further discoveries. Anybody who has a collection in a public setting, in my view, has the moral responsibility to continue to surface new information. And sometimes it's very hard, and sometimes you have assets, and I think this is the case with this collection.
Hi, my name is Dimitri, and first of all, I want to congratulate you on becoming the new director of the MFA.
Thank you.
And the MFA having a person of your stature as a new director. And I have a question about the plans that you might have of possibly cooperating the Arms and Armor Collection here with the works of art at the MFA, and perhaps some kind of thematic relationship with, let's say, Rococo paintings and small swords, or heroic armors and the Mannerist paintings, or something of this nature, because at the MFA, there is really no Arms and Armor wing at all, or even singular objects on display. Correct me if I'm wrong. Unless they're ethnic, African or Oceanic or something like this. Is there something that you kind of thinking over in this terms of cooperation?
So I'm going to give you a layered response. I'm going to keep it simple. First of all, it's harder and harder to acquire things of anywhere because of provenance, because of cost, because of rarity. Sometimes some museums are very good, effective at getting the best things. The high quality items just no longer exist. There are entire categories when say you cannot go after certain types of works of art. So the future is all about collaboration, exchange, and partnerships. That's for sure. Second, I'm entering my 7th month as the director of the Museum of Fine Arts. We have 500,000 objects. I'm starting to become acquainted with some of them. But the truth is, I'm going concentric circles. I'm thinking about what are the partnerships in Boston as far as Cambridge, right? Or all these other museums. Obviously, I'm interested in partnerships across Massachusetts and be delighted to discuss a project like that. But I'm also careful not to be the kind of director who comes with a certain air of expertise and just say, obviously, the priority is to do the things I like. I am not here to decide what I like. I'm here to help my colleagues. We have more than 40 curators. They're bubbling with ideas all the time, and other staff have ideas. And I want to make sure that if I were to do something like that, I have partners on the staff who want to do it, who are excited about it, see the merit of it. I have not given a lecture like this at my home museum for a reason. I believe I need to give space to everyone. There may be a time where we discuss arms and armor, but I'm cautious. A small anecdote, the MFA was founded to be an arms and armor museum. Did you all know that? So there was the Lawrence collection, which was such a great collection. Somebody had lived in the UK for quite some time, that a few citizens of Boston decided it was time to create a museum worthy of this collection. And therefore, the MFA was founded in 1870 to become this Arms and Armor Museum. And then the Great Fire of 1872 burned the entire collection, which was stored in a warehouse, and the inventory, so we don't even know what it was. Very few things had been on loan and survived the fire. And then the MFA proceeded to explore other types of art, including paintings, can't really blame them, antiquities and other things, but never really went back to the original concept of arms and armor. So we actually have very little, but we do have about 600 Japanese swords. And in some areas, we have great swords. Those swords are not just the quantity, they're actually really great swords, but not a lot of Japanese armor, and certainly virtually no Western armor. So partnership, in my view, would be a great thing. I'm not going to precipitate anything, but open for discussion on how we could do that. I think it would be very good because, as you see, the benefit of a lecture is you can summon objects that live in different places. Here's an image of something that is in UK or in Spain. Here is something that is in Russia, and they yet are together, have something to say collectively. It's harder to do as an experience in a gallery, and yet through loans, through partnership, you can get closer to that. So it ought to be tried. Somebody already has a mic. Yeah.
I'm curious if there are any cultures made armor for women.
Not to my knowledge. Not to my knowledge, but there are many cultures that did not have armor. The Gauls, for example, were famous. The Romans observed they liked fighting naked and painted in blue, and it was a form of bravado. And so we should not assume that while armor is useful, that you have to buy in. Armor, as periodically people said that's an act of cowardice to wear armor. And there are moments even when in cultures where armor was important, we just drop it and say, never mind, I don't need all this stuff. So for women, we know that armor was made for women, but it was always under very exceptional circumstances. I had a chapter about gender, which I sadly eliminated to be on time. But women play an important part in armor more than one would believe. So some of them inherited the workshop of their husbands after they died. And there's a famous woman in Graz who ran that workshop for 20 years. Not only her husband, he was not dead, he fled. He was indebted, and he just abandoned ship. He left her with the children, and he was never to be found. And she had all the creditors knocking at her door, and she was trying to keep this place running. And she was a businesswoman. And there's actually an article, very, very long article in German. There's all the sources. You see what she had to go through. But there are many women who ran armor-making workshops. So they were not forging armor, but they were meeting the clients. They were making deals. They had to compensate the male journeyman. They had to figure out what niche of the market they should be in. They managed the finances, and so that's a story that is virtually untold. And when women were often patrons, so there's an armor at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, there's another one in Cleveland, there's one in Chicago. It's part of a series commissioned as a Christmas gift by a wife or her husband. He got a series of armor so he could play with his friends. He could have tournaments together. So it's a part of a series. And we know that women then had to make a decision. From whom am I going to buy these armors? What should they look like? What's the design? And I could keep going, but there is more to it than what I've shown here. And it's part of the challenge. It's definitely a very male territory. But it is not it's not a rampart between men and women as one might imagine based on this presentation. There's more of an osmosis, and that's where scholarship, I think, is still taking us. There's a lot of inquiries to be made.
It was a fascinating talk, thank you. Being the daughter of a metallurgist, I find it really fascinating with the properties. Do we know anything about how the armorer might have tested the pieces or demonstrated them to the customer? Because obviously you couldn't test, a finished piece because then that would maybe ruin it, or?
So I can answer these questions. So some of the Italian armors of the 15th century have the maker's mark. So there's I made this. Now the makers were not good at making all the parts of the body, so they had subcontractors. You make the legs, I make the helmet, but you work for me, so I put my mark on top of yours. So they have combination of marks. And the subcontractor made this part. I'm the contractor. I put my mark, even though I didn't make this. Now sometimes they stamp their mark multiple times. That's showing against what weapons the armor would be effective. So if it was effective in crossbows, you get twice the mark of the maker. So how did they test them? They effectively fired them. They did fire them. So it's possible they would fix the armors after having fired them, and then so they would look nice. But beginning in the mid-16th century, it's actually not a bad thing to show everybody that you should not even try, right? So you keep your dents. There's an armor in Paris that was presented by the city of Brescia to Louis XIV, by which time almost no one was fighting in armor. But the Brescian craftsmen at the time had no sense of ergonomy and shape. They made a series of tubes. It's one of the ugliest armors ever made. But it was bulletproof. And they shot at it, and every dent caused by the bullets was decorated with little flowers. So the armor is decorated, and they made sure to put around embellishments to say, see? So Louis XIV represented something that would be battle-proof, ugly, but nevertheless done with great care, and we know that they would fire them. I went through records in Salzburg, where they would shoot at every armor that would be delivered, and then they would send them back, and you see there's the same people keep getting the armor shot through. So I don't know why they stayed in the business, but it's actually rather interesting. It was a thing. Sometimes the clients would bring their own people and they said, I'm going to have this person shoot this armor. I'm not paying if it doesn't work. And they go to a notary and they notarize an agreement that, yes, they can break it. They don't have to pay for it.
First of all, thank you so much for your time today. And this was a terrific presentation. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about restoration and preservation of some of these suits of armor, because when you see them in person, they look like they're brand new, and they're hundreds of years old. And I understand there's climate control nowadays, but how have these pieces of armor survived in such good condition for so long?
So one short answer is they were for a very, very long time considered the most important thing that anyone had. It's hard for it to believe it. But when Philip II, who basically inherited Charles V's empire, ruled over the New World and had Hungary and most of Central Europe and Flanders and Spain and Portugal and yet other territories, he said, when I die, you can sell everything except the tapestries and the armors, mine and that of my ancestors. This belongs to the crown of Spain. This is part of who we are. The Titians, the other stuff, doesn't matter. Sculpture, can sell it. But do not touch the armor. He had actually spent his own money to buy his father's armor. It was sold at auction. Charles V was so indebted when he abdicated that he stepped in and said, I won't let that happen. That needs to stay in the family. He was not the only one. So for centuries, it was part of their heritage, cultural heritage, to preserve them, to worship them almost, to maintain them. And we have records even like 1800 in places like Hohenschau, which is in Bavaria, of a locksmith being paid to polish the armors. that are still in situ, have been there for centuries. Now, not all of them were taken care of. The ones that sat in churches tended to be really neglected. They became just taken for granted. They tend to brown over time. That is, there's a patina or slow rust process. And then that's our misfortune. A lot of 19th century collectors were interested because of the sort of Victorian stories about the knight in shiny armor. They would not want an armor that was brown. So they would have somebody take it off, and the dealers preemptively would start polishing of the armors, and therefore many of the ones we see, not all of them, have been somewhat restored. They've been ground down, the gilding has been refreshed, the blackening has been put back in place. Sometimes it went to the point that basically destroyed the object. Other cases was done very sensitively. Almost all of them have had intervention. So they look good, but it's part also like in recent years, like say the last 50 years, conservation has become a deeply professional field, understanding of chemistry, and also with guiding principles about trying to avoid doing things that are irreversible. This means that the standards of care have gone up so much, the understanding also what is wrong. So for example, one challenge with the restoration of any armor is the leather straps that attach the pieces to another. Unfortunately, the only leather that's truly safe is the one that stands the way that is most polluted. The one has been used from times immemorial. There used to be one place in the UK that made the hide that is suitable. They just shut down. And there is no source of, you can find leather, but that leather that is not going to cause a chemical reaction with the metal is very, very hard to find. And that type of leather was still available until recently. So the problem is with certain crafts and well-intended and perfectly appropriate environmental regulations, some of the trades that you counted on are just no longer available. Same with mercury gilding. You don't do mercury gilding anymore. So some restorations have become more difficult. And then here I'm trying to entice you, so I showed the nice ones. But there's some armors that have suffered, that have been abused, that are just in terrible condition. And we love them anyway, but some of them show their age. And you have some in the collection. There's a painted bowl of a salad. Has flame-like design, triangular design, seems to have had multiple campaigns of them being painted during its working life, maybe with heraldic colors, and that has been more or less left alone, but it's hard to see. Fortunately, no one has gone in and tried to put new paint that would look like a pastiche. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I am curious about, I love the whole business of how armor is, in fact, viewed as art. I'm having a little trouble sort of deciding how effective it was in determining a battle. I mean, I think today, for instance, tanks, a whole row of tanks would be pretty awesome, right? And I guess depending upon the century or the country, whether you had, 100 knights or 5 who just represented the king and his princes, or I imagine you have foot soldiers and you have archers, and then you've got the regular cavalry, and then you have the knights. Give me a picture.
I think you're answering the question. The question is tactics are more important than just having the hardware. There are countless stories into the 20th century of better equipped armies, larger in numbers, better provision, that lose the battle because of miscalculations about the terrain, the weather, the decision made in the moment. So if you're really talking about effectiveness, it's one key ingredient. I'm not aware of a single conflict that was won unilaterally because of the armor. However, we do know that people panicked when they couldn't source enough pieces to equip their troops before a battle. And so there would be periods where everybody's knocking at the same door and say, we have a war. We need 10,000 breastplates pronto. And what you observe is that no one had stockpiled enough to deliver to everyone at the time or could keep up with the demand. So the prices go up, and there's this other story of the need to have it is a reminder that it was highly effective for a very long time. And in part, the art itself died because there's a thing called the military revolution, this idea that large troops, organized, disciplined, wearing uniforms, following instruction as opposed to heroic warriors, is something that happened slowly, but more or less during the Renaissance and culminated in the 17th century. And the military revolution brought about uniformization, standardization that includes the calibers of the firearms used. Same with the armor. So all the fantasy, all of the special rapport between an armor and client goes through the window. And that's when somebody says, I need 1,000 in 2 weeks, can you do it? And it needs to be cheap. And it's no longer noblemen who commission the armor, it's bureaucrats who have a budget. And the armorers couldn't find anymore enough high-end patrons to train their apprentices, to specialize, and that's the beginning of the end. So every armorer whose biographies I studied in my career, living around 1550, they train their students to be lawyers. Their children to be, their male children to be lawyers. They go to Bologna, they go to law school there. They enter other trades. Or they become goldsmiths, but they don't encourage them to stay in business. So I share a number of names. To the degree we know what happened next with Pfaffenhauser or the Helmschmied, it's always the same story. If you're very successful a craftsman in those days, you move up by getting a degree. You go to college. You get a degree, you earn more respect, you enter a new social strata, you have broader opportunities. The success in itself was inherently would kill the next generation within that lineage of makers. So it's very rare to have 2 or 3 generations of great armors. At some point, it plateaus and then they move out. Don't know if I've really answered your question, but basically armor was never determinant. I think the point I made is it might have been even more important for the image making that it was for winning war.
All right, and we're conscious of time and we want to get Pierre home before the big snow. So you do have about 20 minutes if you do want to go into the galleries. We thank you so much for coming and thank you so much for your time today, Pierre.